I used to think the scariest thing was someone breaking in at night. But no, the scariest thing is someone walking into your life, quietly pretending to care for your grandchild, cooking breakfast, and poisoning everything spoon by silver spoon, smile by smile. That morning Ghost, our dog, charged in and flipped the soup bowl she had made for Caleb. Minutes later, he was vomiting and collapsing. And that's when I realized not everyone comes to heal. Some come to settle old scores from the past. If you think this is just a family story, you'd better keep watching. Subscribe to our channel now to catch more stories that strike deep into the heart. Under the pale Vermont morning light, the kettle whistled softly on the stove, sending curls of steam into the stillness of the kitchen. Eli Carson sat at the edge of the pine wood table, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that bore the faded emblem of the Brattleboro Police Department. The aroma of black coffee burnt slightly at the edges, like always curled into the air around him. Outside the frosted windows, snow dusted the ridgelines, and everything beyond the glass looked painted in quiet. At 63, Eli had grown into the kind of silence most men spend a lifetime fearing. The silence of a house too large for two people. The silence of unsaid things of grief that had settled like dust across every surface. Only two things broke that silence now. The sound of 5-year-old Caleb's small feet tapping across hardwood floors and the low breathing of Ghost, the thick-coated Alaskan Husky, sprawled beneath the kitchen table like a sentry too tired to sleep. Ghost's fur shimmered silver in the filtered sun, his amber eyes flickering open every so often, as if checking confirming guarding. "Pop, pop!" Caleb called, his voice wrapped in sleep, dragging his blanket down the hallway behind him like a cape. "Is it Pancakes Day?" Eli glanced down at the boy, freckles still smudged with Dream's hair pointing in 5 directions, and forced the corner of his mouth upward. "It's Saturday, isn't it?" he said, standing joints creaking like tired wood. "Pancakes Day it is." There was something sacred in these rituals. The batter mix, the smell of maple syrup warming on the stove, the clatter of cutlery mismatched over years of life. Eli liked things that repeated. They gave shape to time. And lately time was the only thing he couldn't track. He set Caleb up at the table with a placemat full of dinosaurs and a tiny plastic fork that had survived since Hannah's childhood. The boy babbled about a dream involving flying shoes and chocolate volcanoes, his words coming fast, excited, unfiltered. Eli only half listened. He always listened, he had to, but there was a part of him that floated slightly above everything now, always watching the way the light moved in the room. The way Ghost's ears would twitch at subtle sounds. The small shifts in Caleb's tone that meant more than words. It was the old detective instinct still alive beneath the soft layers of grandfatherhood. As he poured pancake batter into the pan, a flash of movement caught his eye. Ghost raising his head, suddenly ears up, muscles tense. Eli paused, spatula in hand, and looked. Nothing. Just wind through the birch outside. A cardinal darting across the feeder. Ghost's head slowly lowered again, but his eyes stayed open. "I know," Eli muttered under his breath, almost a whisper. "I feel it too." He turned back to the pan, trying to shake it off. He shouldn't have felt anything. Not today. Not after the months he'd spent trying to rebuild something like a life for Caleb. Not after the weeks of steady routine of carefully layered normalcy. But grief was a sneaky bastard. It didn't just sit in the photo frames or the silence of an empty room. Sometimes it looked like a shadow at the edge of your vision, or the hollow in a voice that should have been fuller. It had been 14 months since Hannah died. The memory didn't come in words or details, but in flashes. Blue lights painting the snow, an officer he didn't know. Knocking on his door, a coroner's voice too calm to be real. Car crash, single vehicle, no brake marks, no skid. Nothing but a crumpled silver sedan wrapped around a pine tree on Route 22. She'd been 37. A district attorney. Brilliant, fierce, unforgiving when it came to justice, and tender in ways she never let anyone but her father and her son see. Eli had buried his daughter in a snowstorm, and now Caleb was all he had left. He flipped the pancakes. Ghost rose slowly from beneath the table, stretched with the slow grace of something ancient, and padded to the living room window. He sat down head high, watching something Eli couldn't see. There was a knock at the front door. 3 quick raps, light, measured. Eli checked the clock. 7:48 a.m. He wasn't expecting anyone. His gut tightened in that old familiar way, the kind that had saved him in alleyways and bad busts and middle-of-the-night domestic calls. He wiped his hands, gestured to Ghost, who moved back toward Caleb, placing himself directly between the boy and the entryway. Eli opened the door. She was younger than he expected. Late 20s, maybe early 30s. Shoulder-length auburn hair pulled into a low bun, slate gray coat buttoned to her throat. She carried a small duffel in one hand, a manila folder in the other. "Mr. Carson?" Her voice was light, confident. "I'm Lauren Parker, from the caregiver registry. You called about a live-in?" Eli blinked. It took him a second to remember the application he'd filled out 6 weeks ago, more out of desperation than hope. He hadn't expected anyone to answer, especially not someone like her. Yeah, he said slowly. "You're early. I had an opening in my schedule. Thought I'd drive up last night and stay in town." She smiled. "Not wide, controlled. If this is a bad time, I can..." "No," Eli said. "It's fine. Come in." Ghost didn't bark, but his low growl vibrated across the floorboards as soon as her boot touched the hardwood. Caleb peeked around the corner, eyes wide. "Hi there," Lauren said, kneeling to his height. "You must be Caleb. I brought dinosaur stickers." Caleb smiled, instantly charmed, but Ghost stepped between them, his body tense, his growl deepening. "That's Ghost," Eli said, watching carefully. "He's protective." Lauren straightened slowly, giving the dog a respectful distance. "He's beautiful." Ghost's hackles didn't lower. His gaze never left her. Eli's eyes narrowed. They sat in the kitchen 10 minutes later. Pancakes, growing cold folders spread out on the table. Her resume was perfect degree in early childhood development, CPR, certified glowing references from 3 families across New England. No red flags, no gaps, no inconsistencies. She smiled when she talked. Asked about Caleb's routines, his favorite toys, his bedtime schedule. She even remembered to ask if he had any allergies. Eli answered politely, but the detective inside him was stirring. Something about her was too polished, too rehearsed, like a script performed hundreds of times, and Ghost still hadn't stopped watching. After she left that morning, said she'd return Monday to start, Eli lingered in the doorway, watching her car roll down the driveway. Caleb was upstairs drawing. Ghost sat beside the stairs, unmoving. Eli crouched beside him, running a hand over the dog's thick fur. "You don't like her." Ghost didn't respond, just stared at the road where Lauren had disappeared. "Yeah," Eli whispered. "Me neither." The snow outside had picked up, a soft flurry turning the driveway white again. Caleb laughed upstairs, the soundlight bright, too pure for a world this heavy. Eli stood every joint stiff with memory. He thought of the way Lauren had lingered when she touched the photos on the fireplace. How her eyes had paused on Hannah's smile just a beat too long. How she'd known the exact nickname Caleb's mother used for him, though Eli had never said it aloud. A coincidence, maybe, but the world didn't run on coincidences. Not the world Eli knew. Ghost lay down again at the foot of the stairs. His ears didn't relax. His tail didn't move. Outside, snow erased footprints, covered tire tracks, hid everything you didn't want to see. And inside the house, something invisible had shifted. Not broken. Not yet. But the stillness wasn't peace anymore. It was warning. Under the gray light of the following week, Lauren Parker slipped into the rhythm of the Carson household with the kind of quiet efficiency that made Eli both relieved and deeply unsettled. She was good. Too good. Each morning she rose before Eli, dressed in soft sweaters and muted colors, hair tied back in a precise knot. She made breakfast without a sound. Steel-cut oats, scrambled eggs, sometimes pancakes with blueberries cut to uniform size. She kept the kitchen spotless, folded laundry into crisp, perfect lines, knew exactly how much syrup Caleb liked on his waffles. She read to him at night with a voice that never cracked or stumbled, and hummed lullabies Eli hadn't heard since Hannah was young. The boy clung to her like ivy to old brick. But Ghost wouldn't get close. He didn't bark, he didn't lunge, he didn't snap, he just stared. Wherever Lauren went, the dog followed his amber eyes, tracking her movements with the intensity of a predator measuring threat. If she entered the room, he would rise and reposition himself between her and Caleb. When she spoke to the boy, Ghost's ears flattened. When she cooked, he watched every move of her hands. When she touched Caleb, adjusting his collar, brushing crumbs off his chin, Ghost would emit a low, almost inaudible rumble, the kind of sound that lived in the bones more than the ears. Eli noticed it all, noticed, cataloged, and told himself to wait. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the dog adjusting. Maybe, like the rest of them, Ghost was still grieving, still guarding Ghosts. But deep down, Eli didn't believe that. He'd trusted Ghost with his life more times than he could count. On back roads with broken taillights, in standoffs where seconds meant survival, in alleyways where people lied with tears in their eyes and knives in their pockets. Ghost didn't panic. He didn't exaggerate. He only reacted when something was truly wrong. And lately he hadn't taken his eyes off Lauren Parker for a single second. That Saturday morning, a heavy frost coated the windows, feathering the glass in delicate veins. Eli was pulling on his boots by the front door when he heard the clang of a bowl hitting the tile. Then the sound of Caleb choking. By the time he reached the kitchen, the scene had already fractured. Ghost was standing over a shattered ceramic bowl fur, bristling, growling low and steady. Thick soup spattered across the floor, steam still rising in thin curls. Caleb was doubled over in his booster seat, small hands clutching his stomach, face pale. "Pop, pop," he whimpered, then gagged bile hitting the side of the chair. Lauren was on her knees in an instant, hands fluttering like frantic birds. "Oh, God. Caleb, baby, are you okay?" She turned to Eli, eyes wide with tears. "I don't understand." "He eats this all the time, carrot and ginger. He loves it." Eli was already by Caleb's side, scooping him up, heart hammering. The boy's skin was clammy lips, losing color. Ghost stood in place, not moving, not barking. But his entire body was locked, tense, coiled, focused like a sniper's breath before the shot. "I'm taking him to urgent care," Eli snapped. "Grab a blanket." Lauren moved fast, wrapping a small throw around Caleb's shoulders. Eli didn't look back. Ghost followed them to the truck pause, clicking sharp across the driveway ice. Inside the exam room, under the hum of fluorescent lights and the sterile scent of latex, Eli held his grandson's tiny hand, while the physician ran tests, checked vitals, and asked questions that felt too simple for the storm churning in Eli's gut. "No fever," the doctor murmured. "No rash. Blood pressure's a little low, but stable. No signs of infection." He paused, eyes skimming the chart. "Could be food intolerance, possibly allergic reaction." Eli shook his head. "He's had carrot soup 100 times. I've made it myself." "Well, ingredients can vary. Could be a spice, a thickener, even a preservative." His system might have reacted this time. Caleb stirred in his sleep on the exam bed, cheeks flushed, breathing even, but thin. Ghost sat in the corner silent and still. His presence the only constant Eli could trust. "Keep him hydrated," the doctor added. "If he worsens or vomits again, come back. But for now, rest. It could be nothing." Nothing. That word echoed in Eli's skull all the way home. He carried Caleb inside, tucked him into the couch, under 2 blankets, and watched as the boy sank into the kind of exhausted sleep that only children and the deeply ill could manage. Lauren brought a glass of water. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I checked everything. The soup was fresh. I tasted it myself." Eli looked at her, and for a brief second, the detective inside him stirred. "You tasted it?" She nodded, voice tight. "Of course. I always taste it first. I never give Caleb anything I haven't." But he wasn't listening anymore. He was watching Ghost. The dog had sat at the threshold of the living room, unmoving, staring at Lauren with a gaze that held no room for forgiveness. His tail was low, his body was still, and his eyes said what no words ever could. "You did something." Later that night, Caleb finally stirred. He wasn't hungry, but he drank apple juice and curled against Eli's chest, small arms wrapped tight. "Don't like soup," he mumbled sleepily. Noted Eli murmured back. Ghost lay at the foot of the couch, chin resting on his paws, eyes still fixed on the hallway. When the house settled into sleep, Eli walked the perimeter like he used to when Hannah was little. Checked the locks, turned off the lights, peered out into the frozen yard where moonlight painted everything in silver unease. Then he noticed Ghost. The dog hadn't followed him to bed. He hadn't taken his usual place beside the foot of Eli's bed, hadn't curled on the rug outside the bedroom door. Instead, Ghost had parked himself in front of Caleb's room, upright, awake, on guard, like he was waiting for something or someone. Eli stood at the top of the stairs, watching his old partner, the one with fur and teeth and a soul too perceptive for human understanding. "You smell something I don't," he whispered into the dark. Ghost didn't look away, didn't blink, didn't move. And downstairs, far across the house, a floorboard creaked. Quiet. Soft. Too soft. Eli felt the hair on his arms rise. He turned back into his bedroom, locked the door with a click, and pulled the handgun from the safe beside the dresser. Not because he believed he needed it. Not yet. But because something in the house no longer felt like home. Something had shifted. And Ghost had known it before anyone else. Long before the soup. Long before the vomiting. Long before Lauren Parker arrived with her perfect references and her soft sweaters and her practiced smile. The storm hadn't come yet, but the dog had already dug in, waiting, watching, refusing to sleep. The frost hadn't melted by mid-morning, though the sun was out and pretending to warm the earth. Inside the house, Eli sat at the dining room table staring at the open laptop before him. A single line blinking at the top of the caregiver background report. Lauren Parker, age 29. No aliases. No prior convictions. No financial delinquencies. No inconsistencies. It was too clean, too quiet. He scrolled again, hoping for a red flag. A footnote, a digital ripple, something. But the document read like a model citizen's resume. Her certifications were current. Her references impeccable. Her education timeline lined up. Even her CPR renewal date was within 6 months. And that was the problem. In Eli's 3 decades as a cop, he'd seen patterns, some so subtle, the rookies missed them entirely. Real people didn't fit into systems that neatly. People made mistakes. They changed jobs too fast, forgot to renew licenses, fell behind on taxes. Normal lives were messy. Lauren's life, at least on paper, was sterilized. Sterile. Eli leaned back in the chair, eyes narrowing. Ghost sat near the window, chin resting on the sill, watching the road like he was waiting for something to return. Or someone. Upstairs, Caleb was quiet in his room, drawing again. The boy had taken to sketching in the weeks since Lauren arrived, filling sheets of printer paper with colored scribbles that Eli didn't always understand. Yesterday, he'd drawn a figure with long hair standing beside a house and labeled it Mom. That alone had nearly shattered Eli. But this morning, when he'd gone to pick up Caleb's discarded sketches, a new drawing made his blood turn to stone. A black box. No windows. Crayon lines thick and angry. Inside it, a woman with yellow hair, arms outstretched, mouth wide, in what looked like a scream. Across the top, in wobbly child handwriting, Mom in the dark room. Eli stared at the image for a long time, the room spinning ever so slightly. Caleb didn't know about the mental institution. He didn't know about the long-ago patient who'd been locked away after attacking a nurse. He didn't know. Couldn't know that his mother had once prosecuted a case involving a woman who'd tried to escape a facility in upstate Vermont, claiming she'd been imprisoned unjustly, and that her therapist, Eli's wife Margaret, had experimented on her. The accusations were wild, delusional, and the woman had been diagnosed with severe schizophrenia and institutionalized indefinitely. Her name had been Patricia Langley. Eli hadn't thought of her in years. But the image of Caleb's drawing brought her back in full color. That night, Eli made dinner. Grilled cheese and tomato soup, Caleb's favorite. Lauren helped Caleb wash his hands, her movements smooth, maternal. She laughed when the boy splashed water. Her voice was soft, her smile warm. It should have eased him. It didn't. Eli watched as Lauren reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, and the sleeve of her sweater slipped just enough. His eyes caught it instantly. A thin white line about 3 inches long just above her wrist. Straight. Intentional. Faded now, but unmistakable. A self-inflicted scar. Eli looked away before she noticed. He'd seen that scar before. Not on her, but in the medical photos from Patricia Langley's file. It was the exact same place, the exact same trajectory. Dinner passed in a blur. Caleb talked about dinosaurs and comets and why the moon didn't fall down. Lauren laughed, nodded, encouraged. Ghost didn't eat. He stayed pressed against the side of the fridge, eyes locked on Lauren, muscles stiff as steel. Later, after dishes were done, Lauren lingered in the living room. Eli was wiping the sink when he realized she hadn't left for her room. He found her standing in front of the mantel, fingers ghosting over the edge of a framed photo. It was a picture of Margaret, taken the summer before she died. She stood in the backyard, Caleb in her arms, the sun catching her hair in that halo-like way Eli had once loved so deeply it hurt. Her eyes were half closed, laughing, alive. Lauren touched the glass like it meant something more than just respect. She was beautiful, she whispered. Eli didn't respond. She looks familiar. Eli's spine straightened. You've seen that picture before, he asked quietly. Lauren hesitated. Just for a second. But to Eli it felt like a siren. No, she said softly. I just meant, she looks like someone I knew. Once. A long time ago. Eli stepped into the room, trying to keep his voice steady. You said you were from Bar. Did you ever spend time near Brattleboro? That's where Margaret practiced. Lauren's face remained still unreadable. No. I mean, maybe passing through. Caleb interrupted, then running into the room, holding another drawing. He thrust it upward proudly. Look, Grandpa, Ghost and me in the park. Eli smiled, forced and tired, and tousled the boy's hair. Lauren bent to look at it. You're a great artist, she said. Then reached for the drawing still sitting on the end table from earlier, the one Eli had stared at all afternoon. The black box. The screaming figure. Who's this? She asked, voice light. Caleb looked at it, then shrugged. Mom, he said. She's trapped. Lauren's eyes flicked up. Her voice caught just slightly. Trapped, yeah. She's stuck in the room. There's no windows. But she hears someone walking. Outside. Silence filled the room like smoke. Eli stared at her. Lauren stared at the drawing. Caleb didn't notice. He ran off again, chasing Ghost down the hallway. The dog didn't stop. Didn't turn. Didn't even wag his tail. That night, Eli couldn't sleep. He sat in his office, lights off, blinds drawn. He opened his locked filing cabinet, the one he hadn't touched since Margaret's funeral, and pulled out an old leather folder marked Confidential in red ink. He flipped through pages, yellowed with time, clinical assessments, behavioral charts, court transcripts, and finally her intake photo. Patricia Langley, age 21, committed after multiple psychotic breaks, suspected dissociative identity disorder, suicidal ideation, and a scar on her left wrist, exactly like the one Lauren had. He pulled out his phone, opened the caregiver agency's site, typed in Lauren's references. 2 numbers rang disconnected. The third was answered by a man who said he'd never heard of her. Eli stared at the phone in the dark. Outside Caleb's room, Ghost still stood guard. And Eli knew the past hadn't just returned. It had never left. The scream ripped through the silence like torn fabric. Eli sat up instantly in the dark, his breath caught halfway in his throat. It wasn't human. It was primal. Urgent. Ghost. The dog was barking with a fury Eli hadn't heard since the night they stormed that house in Montpelier 10 years back. Back then, the bark was the last sound before gunfire. Now it was coming from Caleb's room. Eli grabbed the Glock he kept beneath the bed, bare feet thudding against hardwood as he sprinted down the hallway, heart pounding in a rhythm older than fatherhood, older than grief. This was muscle memory. This was war. He shoved the door open. Lauren stood frozen beside Caleb's bed, her hand inches above the boy's blanket. Caleb was asleep, peaceful, unaware. Ghost had wedged his body between her and the bed, hackles raised, bared teeth gleaming in the soft nightlight. His growls were low, constant, vibrating through the floor. "What the hell are you doing?" Eli barked. Lauren jumped, eyes wide with what looked like fear, but not the kind that comes from being startled. It was too fast, too polished. I heard him whimper, she said. "He was kicking the blanket off. I just came to cover him up." Her voice trembled, her hands lifted slightly in mock surrender. Ghost didn't move. Eli kept the pistol low but didn't holster it. "Get out of the room," he said, voice flat. Lauren hesitated. "I said now." She stepped back slowly, glancing at Ghost like she expected him to lunge. He didn't. He just watched her, every muscle taut. Eli waited until she left the room. Waited until he heard her door close. Then he locked Caleb's door from the inside and sank onto the edge of the bed, hand still gripping the gun. Ghost sat beside him, breathing heavily. You knew Eli whispered more to himself than the dog. You knew before any of us did. He looked down at his grandson. Caleb's breath was soft, undisturbed. For now. But the unease in Eli's chest was a weight he couldn't shake. The next morning, Eli said nothing to Lauren. He watched her through his coffee mug, studying the way her eyes avoided his, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she poured milk for Caleb. She laughed too loud at his jokes. She kept glancing at Ghost. The dog wouldn't sit, wouldn't lie down, wouldn't blink. Eli made a decision that afternoon. While Lauren took Caleb outside to play in the snow-covered yard, Eli pulled the stepladder out of the garage. He opened the attic crawl space above the hallway, dust raining down on his shoulders as he shoved a tiny wireless camera into the corner beam angled perfectly toward Caleb's bedroom door. Then he planted 2 more, one behind a vent in the living room and another tucked into a shadow of the kitchen shelf. He didn't know what he'd find, but something inside him, something old and buried under years of loss, was stirring again. By the second night, he had hours of footage. Most of it showed nothing. But at 3:12 a.m., the bedroom door creaked open. Lauren stepped in barefoot, her shadow long and thin across the carpet. She hovered beside Caleb's bed, looking down, not moving, not touching. Ghost entered seconds later, his body slipping in like smoke, placing himself silently between her and the boy once again. Eli hit pause, rewound, played it again, then again. Each time the hair on his neck rose a little higher. He started noticing the details. Lauren never touched Caleb during these visits. She never brought anything in her hands, but she always stared at him. Always waited until Ghost arrived. Always left without speaking a word. It was a ritual, a test, and Ghost was the gatekeeper. By the 5th night, Eli was barely sleeping. He sat in his office surrounded by files, long thought buried. Margaret's old case notes, patient transcripts, letters from institutions with faded headers and half-torn corners, and then he found it. Patricia Langley. The file was thin, not because the story was short, but because most of it had been scrubbed, redacted, locked. Still, Margaret had kept a copy of her initial psychiatric evaluation. Eli read the pages slowly, each word carving into him. Female Caucasian approx. 21 years old at time of entry. Presents with symptoms of psychotic paranoia, delusions centered on mother figures, and identity theft. Exhibits extreme distrust of female authority figures. Several suicide attempts documented. Violent ideations when triggered. Then he saw it. Claimed her therapist stole her memories and accused her of trapping voices in a mirror. The page trembled in his hands. It was Margaret's handwriting in the margins. Possible dissociative identity disorder. Trauma response. Responds to the name Lauren during dissociative episodes. Eli stared at the name. Lauren. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a memory glitch. It was her. He clicked open the caregiver file again, Lauren Parker. Ran it through a national database with a facial scan overlay. And there it was. A partial match. The eyes, the bone structure, the mouth. Just enough similarity for someone who hadn't seen her in 8 years. For someone who'd taken a new name, dyed her hair, hidden the scars. Patricia Langley was alive. She was in his house, and she was watching his grandson. Eli sat back, breath shallow. Margaret had tried to help her. Hannah, his daughter, had prosecuted the staff at the hospital where Patricia was held after a whistleblower accused them of ignoring the signs. Patricia had lashed out in court, screaming about betrayal, about the woman who erased me. Hannah had died 6 months later. A car accident, late night, black ice, no witnesses. Eli felt the bile rise in his throat. He stood slowly, mind spinning. The sound of a crayon breaking snapped his focus. Caleb stood in the doorway, holding another drawing. Ghost sat beside him as always. Pop, pop, Caleb said softly. Ghost doesn't like her. Eli knelt down, his hand trembling as he took the paper. It showed 3 figures, one tall and gray one, with yellow hair, and one small holding a leash. Above them, the sun had a face. But beside them, a box. Black, empty. She goes in there when nobody's looking, Caleb said. Who, Eli asked, though he already knew. Caleb leaned in, whispering like it was a secret. Lauren. She talks to the mirror. Eli felt something crack inside him. Not fear, not anger, but recognition. Ghost had been warning them all along, and Eli had been too slow to listen. The snow fell harder that day, like the sky was hiding something. Eli stood by the kitchen window watching Caleb roll a ball of snow in the front yard. Lauren crouched beside him, her red gloves a bright stain against the white. She laughed when he tossed a handful at her. From a distance, they looked like any loving caregiver and child. But Eli had already learned the danger of still waters. He turned from the window and reached into the drawer below the counter, pulling out the sandwich bag he'd sealed 2 nights ago. Inside was a spoonful of beef stew scraped from the bottom of Caleb's bowl after dinner, just before he'd grown groggy and glassy-eyed and gone to sleep without his usual fight. Eli had already sent it to a private lab in Montpelier. Discreet. No records, no questions, just answers. That afternoon, the answer came. Lorazepam. A low-dose benzodiazepine commonly prescribed for anxiety. Not illegal, not lethal, but unprescribed, slipped into food given to a 5-year-old. It was a sedative. It was premeditated. It was poison. Eli stood frozen in the hallway with the email still glowing on his phone screen. He felt like someone had pressed a knife into the center of his chest and twisted. Not enough to kill. Just enough to remind him how close he'd come to losing everything. Ghost padded silently toward him from the living room, his eyes locked on Eli's. The dog knew. Had known. Eli crouched beside him, pressing his forehead gently against Ghost's. I should have listened to you sooner, he murmured. That night, he changed the locks on his study. Then he went to Lauren's room. She was out on the porch with Caleb watching the snowflakes melt on their gloves. Eli didn't have long. He moved fast, methodical, just like the old days. The room smelled faintly of lavender. Too neat. Too untouched. The kind of clean that tried to erase history, not live in it. He checked drawers. Nothing. Under the mattress. Nothing. Then he tried the floorboards beneath the bed. One creaked differently. Hollow. He pulled it up. A leather-bound notebook wrapped in a child's dinosaur print scarf. He opened it slowly. Inside lines of handwritten notes stretched from page to page in neat looping script. 7:15 a.m. Caleb wakes. Prefers apple slices to cereal. Avoids crust. 8:00 a.m. Eli leaves kitchen to read paper. 8:12 a.m. Doorbell rings. Mailman. Ignore. 12:30 p.m. Caleb naps longer after lunch if food is warm. It went on. Pages and pages. Every move, every meal, every smile. She had been documenting him like a subject, no like a possession. Eli's hand trembled as he flipped to the last page. They're written in black ink and underlined 3 times. He will never know what she took from me. But I can take what she left behind. He slammed the notebook shut. That night dinner was silent. Caleb colored at the table. Ghost lay at his feet. Eli stared across the table at Lauren, who smiled too much, blinked too little, and asked how his old detective friends were doing. He lied. Said they were fine. He was buying time. The letter arrived the next morning. No return address. Just his name typed in bold on a plain white envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, computer printed with no fingerprints. One line. No one saved Hannah. Don't let Caleb suffer the same fate. There was no signature, no threat, just a statement. But it was enough. Eli staggered back a step as he read it. His throat dried. The memory of Hannah's crushed car, the call at 3:07 a.m., the closed casket funeral they all returned in waves. He remembered how the snow on the roof of her wreck hadn't even melted, how they said she'd been speeding, lost control. But the autopsy had shown no alcohol, no drugs, just a sudden skid, a fatal tree. Now he wasn't so sure. He made 2 decisions that morning. First, Caleb would stay home from daycare. No more outside contact. Second, he would confront Lauren soon, but not without evidence. That night, Ghost snapped. It was 2:43 a.m. Eli knew because he was already awake, heart drumming in insomnia's rhythm. A sudden sharp bark shattered the silence. Then another. Then a full-throated growl followed by a loud crash. Eli grabbed his flashlight and rushed down the hall. He found Ghost clawing furiously at Lauren's door, his nails shredding the wood. Foam flecked his mouth. He was howling, snarling feral. "Ghost," Eli shouted. The dog didn't stop. The door creaked open suddenly from the inside. Lauren screamed, falling backward in a white nightgown, hair a mess, eyes wild. "Control him," she shrieked. "He's insane." Eli grabbed Ghost by the collar, wrestling him back as the dog snapped at the air between them. "Get in your room," Eli ordered, voice like steel. "I was asleep," Lauren cried. "He just went crazy." Eli didn't reply. He dragged Ghost into the hallway and shut Caleb's door behind him. The boy hadn't stirred, thank God. Lauren stood in her doorway, panting, hugging her arms. "He's dangerous," she said, quieter now. "What if he hurts the boy?" Eli met her gaze. "He's protecting him." For a long beat, neither spoke. Then Lauren slammed her door. Eli leaned against the wall, his breath slow, deliberate. He wasn't going to wait much longer. The pieces were aligning. She was Patricia. He was sure now. And Ghost had drawn the line in the sand. Tomorrow Eli would make a move. And if the past came back to finish what it started, he'd be ready. The facility stood like a wound that never closed. Maplewood Psychiatric Hospital had been shuttered for 5 years now. Eli parked his truck along the frost-bitten edge of the overgrown lot where weeds crept up through cracks in the pavement and the security gate hung limp from one hinge. The place still breathed, just quieter now. Its silence was heavier than snow. Eli stepped through the rusted doors, the air stale with a kind of memory no one wanted to name. Mold curled along the corners of the tiled hallway, and old wheelchairs sat abandoned like ghosts mid-conversation. He moved with purpose, flashlight cutting through dust motes, until he reached the last nurse's station on the West Wing records and release. And she was still there. Miriam Day, 82, the last full-time nurse before the shutdown. She sat in a folding chair with an old kerosene lamp and a crossword puzzle. She didn't look surprised to see him. "Carson," she said, squinting. "Took you long enough." He paused. "You remember me? You came asking questions once. About your wife. Then again after your daughter died. You didn't listen either time." "That cut." Eli pulled up a chair across from her. "I need to find a patient. Patricia Langley." Miriam didn't blink. Instead, she leaned forward, fingers laced. "You're too late if you're here to stop her." He said nothing. "She told me," Miriam went on, "back then, that she wasn't going to disappear. That the justice your daughter buried would claw its way back up. And it looks like she meant it." Eli's hands tightened into fists. "I need the file, Miriam. I need proof." The old woman slowly nodded, then pulled a ring of rusted keys from her sweater pocket. She led him to a storage room 2 doors down. Inside, dusty cabinets stood like tombstones. "Third drawer, L section," she said. Eli opened it, and there it was, Langley Patricia Ann. File number 8743. He opened the folder and saw a face that punched the air from his lungs. A photo paper clipped to the intake report. Same blue eyes, same cheekbones. A younger face, thinner perhaps. Hair darker, but unmistakable. Lauren. There was no more doubt. No more maybes. Just the sinking certainty that the woman sleeping under his roof was the same one who once carved symbols into her skin and whispered in mirrors. And the one his wife had tried to rebuild. And the one his daughter had put on the stand. He flipped through the pages. Evaluations, medication logs, outbursts, solitary confinement orders. Then a note in his wife Margaret's handwriting. Patient exhibits fragmented identity. Obsessed with themes of justice violation and maternal betrayal. Projects trauma onto female caregivers. Strong transference observed. Maybe fixated on therapist as antagonist. Another line added later. Patient claims her memories were altered. Accuses me of stealing her true voice. He turned to Miriam. Was there ever an official complaint filed against Margaret? Miriam looked tired. There were whispers. Some thought Margaret pushed too hard, experimented too freely with recovered memory techniques. But she was brilliant. And your daughter protected her in court when the review board started poking around. Eli's heart slowed to a crawl. She was covering for her mother, he asked. I think she was trying to protect your family name, Miriam said gently. But Patricia said she'd lost more than her mind in those sessions. She said Margaret had turned her into someone she never consented to be. Eli turned away, the weight of history pressing down like cold steel on the back of his neck. He left Maplewood with the file pressed to his chest. That night, the fire crackled low in the hearth. Caleb was asleep upstairs. Ghost lay curled on the rug, eyes half-lidded, but alert. Eli sat alone with a glass of scotch, staring into the embers. He pulled the photo of Patricia from the file again, turned it over. On the back, in her own handwriting, they erased me. I'll make sure the world remembers. Then, like a cruel echo, the flashback came. 6 years ago. The last conversation he had with Hannah before she died. They'd been standing in the front yard, leaves falling like flames around them. She'd just returned from a legal ethics conference and looked tired. "You ever wonder," she said suddenly, "if Mom crossed the line?" Ely had frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I mean, some of her techniques. That woman, Patricia Langley, she said Mom stole her thoughts, forced her to relive things she'd repressed for a reason. The board dropped the case too fast. Because of me." Ely had scoffed. "You prosecuted based on evidence." Hannah had looked away, silent for a moment. She screamed when she saw me, in court. Said I looked like the ghost of the mirror. Like she'd seen me before. Like I'd done something to her. "You didn't, I know." "Then the part he had buried until now," Hannah had whispered. "But what if Mom did?" He hadn't answered her that day. Hadn't called her later either. 3 weeks later, she was dead. Now sitting by the fireplace, with only Ghost to witness. Ely finally said the words. She did. The truth settled like ash. Maybe Margaret had broken something inside Patricia. Maybe Hannah had been the one to cover it up. And now, Lauren Patricia was trying to reclaim the fragments they all helped scatter. Ely knew what had to be done. The cycle had to end, but not in revenge. In truth. The night was colder than it should have been, even for Vermont. Ely moved through the house in silence, his breath shallow measured. Every floorboard had been memorized. Every creak accounted for. Caleb was tucked safely in bed, his chest rising and falling in the rhythm only a child could manage in a world like this. Ghost lay curled beside the bed like a sentinel, ears alert, body tensed beneath a facade of calm. Ely knelt beside the Husky, stroked the back of his neck. "You know what to do, boy," he whispered. "Don't wait for me." He left the bedroom door cracked just enough. Up in the attic, he made his post. A small, dusty crawlspace that overlooked the hallway via a repurposed air vent. He had wired tiny cameras earlier that week, one in Caleb's room, one in the hallway, another facing the kitchen. On his laptop, the black and white feeds blinked to life. At exactly 9:47 p.m., he turned off every light in the house. Then he waited. The hours passed like molasses. At 11:13 p.m., the hallway camera flickered. A shadow passed by the kitchen. Quiet. No lights turned on. Just the dark sweep of someone moving by instinct. Lauren. She wore a long sweater and moved like a person trying not to exist. Eli's pulse quickened. She crept to the hallway cabinet's second shelf far right drawer, where medications were stored. The camera feed caught her hand dipping inside, pulling something out a small amber bottle. She checked it against the hallway light for just a second, then slipped it into her sleeve and walked toward Caleb's room. Ely didn't move. Not yet. He watched as the door creaked open. Caleb shifted but didn't wake. Lauren knelt beside the bed. Ghost growled low and guttural. On the feed, her silhouette froze. Then she pulled the bottle from her sleeve and uncapped it. A medicine dropper glinted in the faint nightlight glow. Ghost exploded. The camera shook slightly as the dog launched into Lauren, snarling, snapping. The bottle clattered to the floor, its contents spilling into the rug. Lauren shrieked a guttural sound of shock and pain as Ghost's jaws closed around her arm. Ely burst through the attic door, nearly toppling the ladder as he leapt down the stairs. By the time he reached the room, Lauren was curled on the floor, blood staining her sweater. Ghost stood over her, breathing hard, eyes wild. Caleb whimpered in his sleep, still untouched. Ely grabbed the rope he'd hidden in the hallway closet. Years in the force had taught him how to move quickly without hesitation. He knelt, straddled Lauren's back, and with expert precision, tied her wrists behind her with 3 coils. "Don't fight it," he said flatly. Lauren didn't speak. She just laughed. Soft, too soft. "I told her I'd come back," she whispered. "But none of you listened." Ely didn't ask who she meant. He knew. He pulled out his phone and called 911. "This is Ely Carson," he said. "I have a suspect restrained in my home. She attempted to drug a child." The dispatcher started asking questions. He answered them all calmly, efficiently, then hung up. He turned back to Lauren. "You're going to answer for what you did to my daughter," he growled. But when he looked again, she was gone. The ropes lay loose on the floor. A trail of blood led out the door. Ely spun, raced down the hallway, but the front door still locked. No windows shattered. No sounds of footsteps. Only silence. Ghost barked once short and sharp, then sniffed at the floor. He followed the blood trail, which ended abruptly at the hallway mirror. It was impossible. Ely had tied her tight. He stood there, stunned, heart pounding in a way it hadn't since the night Hannah died. Ghost sat at the mirror, ears back, and for a moment, Ely could have sworn there was breath on the other side of the glass. But the reflection was empty. The blizzard had no mercy that night. Snow lashed against the windows like claws. The trees outside groaned beneath the weight of ice. Inside the house, the fire had died. And Ely. Ely had finally fallen asleep in the chair near the hearth, his body betrayed by exhaustion, heart still clenched around the echoes of what had almost happened. It was Ghost who woke first, a low growl. Then a bark so violent it shattered the silence. Eli, startled awake, chest heaving. His eyes darted upstairs, Caleb's room. Too quiet. He ran. The bed was empty. The window open, and in the snow below, drag marks. Long, chaotic, like something or someone had been pulled. Eli didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat flashlight rifle and sprinted into the storm. Ghost followed without command, bounding ahead into the freezing dark. They moved as one man and dog, broken and loyal, through a forest that had turned hostile. Every tree loomed like a shadow of regret. The wind screamed not in pain, but in warning. And then footprints. Ghost caught the scent veering off the trail. Eli followed, boots sinking in thick powder. Blood speckled the snow. Tiny droplets. Not Caleb's. Hers. The trail led deeper into the woods, where only ghosts dared live. Until finally, a cabin, half buried beneath snow. Roof caved in one corner, windows blackened. A relic from another decade. Eli approached slowly, gun raised. Ghost growled low. He tried the door. Locked, but from inside a sob. High-pitched, fragile. "Papa?" His heart twisted. He stepped back and kicked the door in. Wood splintered. Snow gusted in. And there, in the center of the room, Caleb sat on the floor, hands tied, cheeks streaked with tears. And behind him, Lauren. But not Lauren. Her hair was matted, face pale, eyes wild with something feral. She wore a mask, old, leather, cracked, a therapist's mask. The kind his wife once wore in experimental sessions, when dissociation was encouraged as a method of psychological mirroring. It hit him like a punch. Lauren wasn't just imitating the past. She was inhabiting it. "Put the gun down," she said calmly. He didn't. She moved behind Caleb, placing a hand on his shoulder. Ghost growled, teeth bared. "I said, put it down, Eli, or the boy sleeps forever." His voice was ice. "You don't want to hurt him," she laughed. A sound like glass cracking. You think I came all this way for tea? Whatever you want, take it out on me." "Oh, I am," she said. "Don't flatter yourself. This isn't revenge. This is equilibrium." Eli took one step forward. Her fingers twitched. He froze. And then she said it, the thing that cracked his soul open. "I just wanted you to know what it feels like. To lose your child." He faltered. "You already took mine," she hissed. "Years ago. When your wife ripped me open and told me I was broken. When your daughter painted me as a liar. When you let the system call me dangerous." "She tried to help you," Eli said. No, Lauren snapped. "She tried to fix me. Like I was furniture. Like trauma could be reupholstered." Eli lowered the gun, just a hair. "You were hurting. She saw that." She saw what she wanted, Lauren spat. "And when I screamed, she sedated me. When I cried, she called it manipulation. When I begged, she wrote in her little book." She stepped forward. "Do you know what it's like to be erased? Eli, to look in the mirror and see only what someone else programmed into you." Eli's voice cracked. "You weren't erased. You're here." She knelt behind Caleb. "I don't want to kill him," she said softly. "But I will. I need you to understand that you're not the hero in this story. You're just the final piece of the sentence." Ghost barked once, sharp, urgent. Eli caught it, the signal. He dropped the gun, then lunged. Lauren screamed, reached for the syringe tucked in her coat. But Ghost was faster. He lunged too, knocking her sideways. Caleb rolled free. Eli tackled her against the wall. The mask fell off her eyes, wide, wild human again. But she fought, scratching, biting, shrieking in tongues only she understood. "You left me in that room," she screamed. "You left me to drown in her words." Eli pinned her down, panting. Blood dripped from her lip. His own vision swam from adrenaline. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know what she did." She stopped, struggling. For a moment, just breathing. Then the tears came. "I was 13 when it started," she whispered. "I just wanted someone to listen. And she dissected me instead. She made me feel insane for remembering." Eli's hands trembled. "I'm sorry." Lauren stared at him. For the first time, she looked tired. Not vengeful, not insane. Just shattered. "I believe you," he said. Then softly, "I forgive you." She closed her eyes. Ghost stood between them, chest heaving. Snow howled outside like the voice of judgment finally passing. Sirens began to rise in the distance. Eli held Lauren's hand. And for the first time, she didn't pull away. The sirens were close now, echoing faintly through the forest, but still distant enough that the cold ruled every second. Eli stumbled outside the cabin, Caleb limp in his arms. The boy wasn't breathing normally. His small chest rose and fell, shallow and stuttering. A fine foam formed at the corner of his lips. His eyelashes fluttered like they were stuck between dreams and darkness. Eli collapsed to his knees in the snow, cradling his grandson, tighter than he ever had. Ghost circled them once, then sat. Silent, steady, watching. Eli pressed his fingers to Caleb's pulse. Still there, weak but there. He looked back inside the cabin, expecting to see Lauren Patricia curled where he left her. But the air had changed. Something was missing. He handed Caleb to Ghost, whispering, "Stay," and stepped back into the shadows. The fireplace still crackled faintly, casting long golden slashes across the dusty floor. The blood where Lauren had bled during the fight had smeared into the wooden boards, but now she lay near the hearth, unmoving. Her hand still clutched something. A bottle. Empty. Her chest didn't rise. Her eyes were open, fixed on nothing. And beside her, neatly placed a small envelope with his name on it. Eli. His fingers trembled as he opened it. Inside were 2 sheets. One was folded in half, stained slightly by the firelight. It read, "I don't need your forgiveness. I never wanted redemption. I just needed you to remember me. Not the monster they wrote in reports, but the girl your wife left in a locked room. The girl your daughter tried to silence. The girl who screamed into padded walls until she forgot her own name. I died years ago." This was just a shadow finishing the sentence. "Let him grow up free of all this. Don't turn him into you, Patricia or Lauren." Eli sank to the floor. The note slipped from his hand, landing by her fingers. He stared at her face, so young, so wronged, so twisted by pain. And yet, in death, there was stillness. Maybe not peace, but stillness. He picked up the second sheet, a drawing. Caleb's drawing. Red crayon. A square cabin. A stick figure with a blue circle around it. A dog with sharp ears. And another figure, black lines, no face, trailing behind them all. A shadow. He dropped the paper and stumbled back out. Ghost hadn't moved. Caleb whimpered now, the sound barely audible, like a whisper through leaves. Eli held him again, burying the boy against his chest, his coat shielding them both from the snow still falling like regrets. The snow soaked his jeans. The wind bit his skin. But he didn't move. He just sat there by the fire, outside the ruin in the middle of nowhere, with Ghost on one side and the fading echo of a siren on the other, and cried, not the way men cry behind locked doors or into their own fists, but truly cried for his wife, for Hannah, for Lauren, for the girl who became Patricia and the system that never saw her, and for himself, for the things he'd believed, for the truths he'd never dared to look at until now. He'd been a good cop, a good husband, a good father on paper, but life wasn't paper. And names weren't truth, and the past wasn't dead. It was buried, poorly, like bones waiting for snowmelt. He kissed Caleb's forehead. "You're okay," he whispered. "You're gonna be okay." Ghost leaned in, resting his muzzle on Eli's shoulder. Together they sat in the silence, and when the sirens arrived, red and blue streaks painting the snow, Eli didn't stand. He waited. He watched them load Lauren's body into a bag, with no ceremony. He didn't stop them, but when a medic reached for Caleb, Eli's voice broke for the first time. "Gently, please." They looked at him. This old man soaked in blood, snow, sorrow, and nodded. And only when the helicopter lifted Caleb away and Ghost jumped in beside him did Eli rise. One last look at the cabin, at the footprints now fading. Then he turned away and let the storm take what was left behind. The hospital room was quiet. Only the rhythmic beeping of the monitor pulsed softly in the air. Caleb lay on the bed, small arms resting above the blankets, his lips pale, his chest rising with each breath, steady but still shallow. Ghost curled at the foot of the bed, head resting on his paws, eyes open and alert. He hadn't moved all night. Eli sat in the chair beside them, his hand barely touching Caleb's. He hadn't spoken in hours. Not since the doctors told him the sedative in Caleb's bloodstream had been strong, but not fatal. He's lucky, they said. Eli didn't feel lucky. He felt hollow. Outside the window, Vermont's winter sun had returned. But it didn't feel like light anymore. It felt like surveillance. Because once the storm ended, the questions began. The police came first. Then the detectives. Then reporters who called him a hero and a fool in the same breath. How did Lauren Parker get access to your home? Why didn't you report her behavior earlier? Did you know about her identity? And beneath all that, the unspoken blame. For letting a woman with no real background into his house. For being a former detective yet missing every sign. For trusting his instincts when maybe they were never worth trusting to begin with. He didn't defend himself. He gave them the facts. All except one. He never told anyone about the letter. The one Lauren no Patricia left behind. Folded into thirds. Written in blue ink. He kept it with him, inside his coat pocket. He read it again the night they buried her. The funeral was nearly empty. No family. No friends. Just two gravediggers, the town chaplain and Eli, standing in a coat too big for his grief. There was no music, just the wind. He stepped to the edge of the grave after they lowered her down, pulled the letter from his pocket, and read it aloud. Not for her, not for forgiveness, for himself. "I just needed you to remember me, not the monster they wrote in reports, but the girl your wife left in a locked room. The girl who screamed into padded walls until she forgot her own name. I died years ago. This was just a shadow finishing the sentence. Don't turn him into you. When he finished, he folded the paper and dropped it in. Then he turned, walked to his car, and didn't look back. That night, he sat at his wife's old desk. The office hadn't changed since her death. Books still lined the shelves. Medical journals, psychology texts, case notes boxed and labeled, each file full of people she once tried to save or didn't. Ely pulled out one box. Her name still stamped on the label. Dr. Lucille Carson, intakes, 2009-2012. He opened it, found Patricia Langley's file. Inside were the clinical notes. BPD symptoms increasing. Dissociative episodes. Violent tendencies when triggered by abandonment. He kept reading and reading until a line broke him. Subject accuses me of using her pain as a research tool. She asked me, what happens if the mirror cracks? Will you still see me then? I responded that mirrors reflect what we are. She didn't respond, just stared at the window silent for over an hour. Ely closed the file. That was the day he made his decision. Not to fix anything, not to rewrite history, but to acknowledge it. To stop pretending the system they upheld hadn't failed someone, multiple someones. To stop thinking justice was just about courtrooms and handcuffs. To stop hiding behind silence. He would open the office again, not as a clinic, but as a center for survivors, for children like Caleb, for women like Patricia, for people who had fallen between cracks that should never have existed in the first place. The town would talk. Let them. The old detective was losing it. Let them, because maybe that was the point, to finally be someone worth remembering. Not just by those who loved him, but by those who were hurt when no one else would look. On a Tuesday morning, weeks later, Caleb walked across the hallway on wobbly legs. Ghost followed, tail wagging. Ely watched from the doorway. You okay? He asked. Caleb nodded, then held up a drawing. It was of a house. 3 stick figures. One was him. One was Ghost. The third had no face, but wore a red coat like the one Ely always wore. Beneath the drawing, in crayon-scrawled letters, it read, "Home is safe." Ely knelt, pulling the boy close. It was the first time Caleb had spoken since that night. Only one word. Papa? And just like that, Ely broke again. But this time it wasn't from guilt. It was from the weightlifting, from something beginning to heal. Not forget, just breathe. The new mornings were quieter, not because the pain was gone, but because they had finally learned to live alongside it. Ely woke early, just before the frost burned off the grass, and brewed coffee, while Caleb still slept upstairs. Ghost would nudge the back door open with his nose, trot out into the yard, and sit near the fence line. Always watching, always listening. His ears twitched with every breeze, but his posture was no longer tense. The constant alertness had softened. Like them, he was healing. The living room had changed. Drawings now lined the fridge windowsills, even the inside of cabinets. Caleb had returned to art with a quiet intensity. He drew Ghost the most, over and over, sometimes in blue, sometimes red, but always those glowing eyes, bright and wide and good. Ely noticed something on one of the newer drawings. Ghost was standing next to Caleb again, but the claws which once stretched long and sharp from his paws were gone. Instead, Caleb had drawn just paws, soft, normal, like any dog, and the eyes, still there, still watching, still loyal. The boy never said anything about the change. But Ely saw it, felt it. That picture was now framed above the fireplace, a symbol of the thing they all needed: safety without suspicion, protection without fear. Twice a week, Ely drove Caleb into town for therapy sessions, not with police officers or state psychologists, but with a local group dedicated to children who had lost parents in violent or unexplained ways. At first, Caleb said nothing. He sat with his crayon box clutched tight in both hands, staring at the walls, chewing the collar of his jacket. But week by week, the silence bent. Not broke, but bent. He started drawing in front of others. Ghost again. Then trees. Then a house with no doors. Then a house with open windows. Then a sunrise. One morning, when a therapist asked the group, "Can someone tell me about a moment they felt protected?" Caleb raised his hand and simply said Ghost. That was it. The room stilled. But the moment had cracked something open. Ely watched from behind the two-way mirror, fingers pressed tight against his lips. Later that same month, the local veterinary association reached out. They had heard what Ghost had done, the alerts, the protection, the attack that saved a child's life, and they wanted to honor him. Ely was hesitant at first. Ghost wasn't some show dog. He didn't sit still for photos. He didn't wag on command. But this wasn't about performance. It was about acknowledgement. At the small ceremony outside the vet's office, a modest crowd gathered. Ghost stood beside Caleb Fur, brushed for the occasion, a little blue bandana tied awkwardly around his neck. When the vet knelt to clip the medallion, a silver paw print medal to Ghost's collar, the dog flinched. But only for a moment. Then Caleb bent down and whispered something into his ear. and Ghost stayed still. A reporter asked Eli afterward what Ghost meant to their family. He replied, "He listens when no one else hears." That used to scare me. Now, I wish I'd listened sooner. That night by the fire, Caleb curled up next to Ghost with a book in his lap. Eli watched them, eyes glassy. "You want me to read it to you?" he asked. Caleb shook his head. "I want to tell Ghost the story." Eli sat back and listened. It was about a boy who got lost in the woods and was afraid of all the shadows. But then a wolf, not a scary one, found him and stayed beside him. It never spoke, but it protected him, even when the boy didn't ask for it. At the end, the boy made it out of the woods. Not because he wasn't afraid anymore, but because he learned how to walk, even while being afraid. "The book closed," Caleb whispered. "Thank you," and kissed Ghost between the ears. Ghost licked his hand. Days became weeks. Eli found himself in a support group of his own, one for former officers, dealing with guilt trauma and institutional reckoning. They didn't meet in churches or city halls. They met in the back room of a library. No uniforms, no names, just truths, and coffee that tasted like old regrets. When it was his turn to speak, Eli talked about listening. "Animals don't lie," he said. "They don't explain. They just react." Ghost knew something I didn't. And instead of trusting that I assumed I was smarter, that I'd know danger if it sat at my table. But instinct doesn't use words. I wish I'd remembered that sooner. Someone across the table, a woman with a badge pinned to her purse strap, nodded. Later she said, "It's not about guilt anymore. It's about what we do with the knowing." Eli started showing Caleb how to read Ghost. Body language, tension in the back legs, tail position. Whimpers too soft to hear, but real. "Animals don't hide," he told him. "But they don't shout either. They just wait for someone who's watching." They'd sit on the porch, just the two of them, watching Ghost nap in the sun. Sometimes they'd play a game. What does it mean when he lifts his paw but doesn't bark? Maybe he wants to move, but something's stopping him. What does it mean when his ears twitch, but he doesn't look up? He's hearing something behind him. He's listening for danger. Do you think he's still scared? Maybe, but he's still here, right? Caleb smiled. Yeah. One night, as snow began to fall again, Eli found himself in the kitchen prepping breakfast for the next morning. Something simple. Oats, honey, fresh apples. He looked at the stove and froze. The soup pot, the same one Lauren had used. He reached toward it, then stopped. Instead, he took it down from the shelf, scrubbed it clean, and set it on the back burner. Not to forget, but to remember differently. The next morning, Caleb came downstairs in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. Ghost padded behind him, still half asleep. Eli handed them each a bowl, one with oatmeal, the other with kibble and bits of turkey. They sat together. Firelight flickering. Snow outside. Warmth within. "Ghost saved me," Caleb said suddenly. Eli nodded. "He saved both of us." Caleb looked up. "Did he save you from Lauren?" Eli paused, then said, "No, he saved me from myself." Caleb blinked, then went back to eating. Some truths don't need explaining, and so the house lived again. Still quiet, still cautious, but filled now with something it hadn't held in years. Possibility, not redemption, not erasure, just possibility. The beginning of a life no longer shaped by the shadows that haunted it, but by the light they decided to follow forward. Together, Eli, Caleb, and Ghost, three souls learning at last to speak the language of silence, and to listen to the things that were never said, but always felt. Spring returned to Vermont like a whisper, soft but sure. The ice thinned first along the rivers, then on the glass edges of windows. Buds pushed out of old wood like secrets rising to the surface. And for the first time in a long while, Eli Carson felt the weight inside his chest, not vanish, but shift. He stood by the front door one morning lacing up his boots when Caleb came down, dragging a scarf and rubbing his eyes. "Where are we going?" the boy mumbled. Eli looked up at him, at the tired little face he had seen learn too much too soon, and said, "Somewhere your mom used to love." Caleb blinked, then nodded. Ghost waited at the door before they even opened it. They drove with the windows cracked. Not wide, just enough to let in air that no longer hurt. Caleb sat in the back hugging a worn-out drawing pad, flipping the pages like chapters of a story only he understood. Ghost sat in the passenger seat, not looking out, watching Eli. The park was smaller than Eli remembered, but maybe that was just time. They parked under the same tree Hannah used to climb the bark, now pale with age, the initials she carved long faded by wind and seasons. Caleb ran toward the swing set, Ghost at his heels. Eli stood still for a moment, then followed. There was a bench by the pond. It creaked under Eli's weight like it remembered him. Caleb sat beside him with Ghost between them, the boy's small fingers buried in the thick silver of the dog's coat. "Is this where Mommy used to play?" Caleb asked softly. Eli nodded. "She was about your age the first time I brought her here. Wouldn't get off the monkey bars until I promised to buy her a snow cone." Caleb smiled. Then it faded. "Why don't I remember her face?" Eli felt the question carve something open. He took a breath. Because your brain protects you when you're little. Sometimes it tucks memories away. But that doesn't mean they're gone. It just means they're waiting. Waiting for what? For when you're ready. Caleb looked down. I want to be ready now. Eli looked at him, really looked. This boy, his boy now. And maybe his second chance. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old photo. It was faded edges, soft with time. Hannah laughing, her hair in two braids, her eyes mid-blink from a joke. Caleb leaned in. Is that her? Eli nodded. She used to call you her moon, he said. Why? Because you were quiet. But when you smiled, everything lit up. Caleb looked at the photo for a long time, then said, I want to tell her something. Eli's voice caught. What would you say? That I'm okay now. That ghost is here. And that you don't cry when you think about her anymore. Eli's throat tightened, because it wasn't true. But maybe today, it didn't have to be. The breeze picked up, and a swirl of petals lifted off a nearby tree, spinning like ash, but falling like snow. Ghost turned his head to the wind, ears perked. His eyes closed slowly, as if remembering something Eli never could. They sat there in silence. Three figures, an old man, a boy, and a dog whose instincts had never failed. Eli felt Hannah in the trees, in the wind, in the way Ghost didn't bark, but still spoke. In the way Caleb no longer asked if he was safe, he just believed it. That was the difference. That was healing. On the way home, they stopped for snow cones. Not because they wanted one, but because they always had. Caleb picked blue raspberry. Ghost got bits of ice in a bowl, which he sniffed, then ignored. Eli watched them from the bench outside the little shop. Sunlight catching in his hair, what little was left. He realized he hadn't checked the locks this morning, hadn't glanced twice at the back gate, hadn't dreamt of Lauren in nearly a week. Maybe that meant he was moving forward, or maybe it just meant he was ready to try. That night back at home, Eli tucked Caleb into bed. The boy turned over and pulled Ghost's paw close like a teddy bear. Do you think she saw us today? Caleb asked. Eli sat at the edge of the bed. I think she sees you every day. And you, I hope she does. Caleb was quiet. Then, do you think she forgives you? The question stunned him, not because it was cruel, but because it was the only one that mattered. I don't know, Eli whispered. Caleb reached out and held his hand. Then maybe you just have to forgive yourself. Eli kissed his forehead, his chest aching. I'm working on it, he said. Later, Eli sat by the fireplace alone. The room glowed, but gently. Ghost lay by the hearth, breathing slow. Eli looked at the framed drawing above the mantel. Caleb and Ghost, no claws, no shadows, only light. Outside, spring rain began to fall. Soft, cleansing. Inside, Eli finally let it come. The sob he had buried. The apology never said. The guilt never named. And when it passed, what remained wasn't emptiness. It was space. Space for something new. Something earned. In the morning, Eli wrote a letter. Not to the police. Not to a hospital. To himself. He wrote, Dear Eli, you did the best you could with what you knew. You made mistakes. And some cost lives. But you also kept one alive. And maybe that's enough. Maybe redemption isn't one grand gesture. Maybe it's holding a child's hand while he learns to live again. And maybe forgiveness isn't given. Maybe it's grown. He folded the letter, placed it in the box of Hannah's keepsakes, and closed the lid. Not forever. Just for now. The story didn't end. Because real stories don't. But it changed shape, like snow turning to river, like loss turning to memory, like grief turning to grace. Eli Carson, once a man built from questions and cases, had found something deeper than answers. He had found presence, not in solving, but in staying, not in guarding, but in listening to a child, to a dog, to the ghosts of his own making, and to the wind in Vermont, always whispering, You are still here. It was a Saturday morning, exactly 1 year after the storm. The house smelled like thyme and roasted tomatoes. Eli stirred the pot slowly, watching the surface ripple. The wooden spoon he used had belonged to his wife. Its handle was worn smooth by time, by memory, by meals that once held warmth and now held history. Behind him, Caleb sat at the kitchen table, swinging his legs, a crayon-streaked drawing in front of him. Ghost lay curled beneath his chair tail, flicking gently whenever the boy dropped a crumb, whether by accident or intention, no one could say. Eli ladled soup into Caleb's bowl, thick, golden, nothing Lauren would have made. Careful, he said. Still hot. Caleb nodded, then picked up the spoon like a soldier ready for duty. He didn't blow on it. He waited. Learned patience from someone somewhere. Probably Ghost. Eli sat across from him watching, just watching. It was still strange, this calm. Strange in the way healing often is not loud, not sudden, but soft. Unfolding in corners in spoons, in ordinary Saturdays. On the wall behind them hung a new photograph. It wasn't staged. Just a moment Eli had caught, on impulse, Caleb hugging Ghost tightly, half asleep on the porch swing. Eli's hand had accidentally caught the edge of the frame in the corner. The sunbeam through the trees made all three of them look lit from within. Below it, hand-lettered in charcoal, listening doesn't require words. Caleb had written it, misspelling require the first time. Eli kept the original paper in a drawer like scripture. Later that morning, while the dishes dried and Caleb built a spaceship from old shoeboxes, Eli stood at the window. Steam curled up from his coffee mug. Outside, Vermont had shifted into a softer season. Not quite summer, just that in-between hush where the trees hold back their full bloom as if listening for permission. A woman walked past the house holding a small child by the hand. They didn't look up, but Eli noticed, and for a moment he saw shadows behind them. Ghosts that didn't haunt only hovered, watching. Witnesses to pain and to progress. The wind stirred, and Eli didn't flinch. He thought of Lauren sometimes. Not often. But when the light hit a certain way, or when he couldn't sleep, or when Caleb asked questions like, "What's the saddest you've ever been?" he'd tell him pieces, but never all. Not because he wanted to hide it. Because some grief was a private language. One ghost understood. One Caleb didn't need to speak yet. But one day, maybe. And when that day came, Eli would sit just like Ghost had sat beside Caleb all those nights, and he would say nothing. Just be there, because now he knew. That was enough. There had been no ceremony when Eli reopened the clinic. No speeches, no ribbon cuttings. Just a new sign with the name his wife had once chosen, the Quiet House. People came in slow waves. A teenager who hadn't spoken in 6 months. A woman who still set 2 plates for dinner, even though her husband had died in '98. A war veteran with hands that trembled too violently to drink tea. They came not for answers, but for witness. And Eli gave them that. Not solutions, just presence. Ghost always there like a sentinel between broken pasts and fragile futures. One evening, a mother came with her son, who had not smiled since losing his sister. Eli sat with the boy while Ghost lay beside him. The boy didn't talk. He simply reached out, touched Ghost's ear, and whispered something so low even Eli couldn't hear. Ghost didn't move, just blinked once, and the boy exhaled. It was enough. The mother cried in the hallway. Eli made no comment. He just handed her a tissue and said, "Sometimes silence is the sound of healing." She nodded, and that was enough too. At home, Caleb drew a picture of a mountain, a dog, and a man standing between them. Underneath, he wrote, "You are my in-between." Eli framed it, next to Hannah's old photo, no longer hidden in a box. But part of the hallway now, part of the story they were still writing. That night after Caleb went to bed, Eli and Ghost sat on the porch. The air was cool, but not cruel. "I don't dream of her screaming anymore," Eli whispered. Ghost turned his head, almost nodding. "I think she forgave me. Or maybe I just stopped needing her to." A pause. "Thank you," Ghost blinked. Then, as if in response, leaned gently against his leg. That was all. Saturday turned to dusk, and dusk into the kind of night Vermont was known for. Quiet, crisp, forgiving. Eli walked past the kitchen one last time before bed and turned off the light, then paused. Just a moment. His eyes caught the photograph on the wall. Caleb. Ghost. Him. A family not made by blood, but by choice, by rescue, by presence. He looked out the window again. The wind moved the curtain slightly. He swore he could hear it whisper. "You stayed." The final line, the one he'd once heard but never understood, now echoed fully. Sometimes the one who saves us isn't human, but the silent thing that stands between us and the fall, just to keep us whole. And Eli finally knew he had been whole for a while now. He just needed the quiet to hear it.